Hey everyone, this is Carly Hasselfeld presenting on the article Where Are the Missing Co-Authors? Authorship Practices in Participatory Research. This article was written by, or dare I say, co-authored by, Danielle Sarna-Wojcicki, I'm sure I just butchered that last name pronunciation, Margaret Perrett, M.V. Eitzel, and Louise Fortman. The overall goal of this text is to educate the reader on the current practices of authorship and participatory research within the scientific community. They also analyze the decision-making and the history behind who gets to be an author or co-author when writing these academic papers. What I mean by this is that they looked into what is the reasoning behind why a professional scientist would give someone the title of a co-author, and more importantly, why might they not give that person the title of co-author. Then they go into defining the different levels of involvement a co-author can have within the research process and how that impacts their credibility as a co-author. This also means a non-academic professional might not understand that they have ownership over the knowledge that they're sharing with these primary investigators and can have and hopefully express how they want this information to be presented to the rest of the community. This is largely to avoid appropriation of a culture or a specific group of minorities. And lastly, we wanted to explore the implications regarding research ethics and participatory research practices. Now, the overall point of this article is to make a stance as to why the discussion of co-authorship matters and should be considered a major component of the participatory research practice. What I appreciated about the authors that wrote this article is that they created a research study with measurable parameters to determine how a co-author is determined by researchers, when they are most likely to be included into an article, and which type of researcher is more often than not to include the participants as a co-author. From their analysis within these different articles and journal entries, they took their findings on co-authorship or how non-academic professionals are acknowledged to address the distributions of power, authority, credit, and responsibility in participatory research. To synthesize the point of the article, this is a quote that I found to be most meaningful. Shifting the meaning of authorship from the physical act of writing to the distribution of authority and accountability in the creation of knowledge is a critical opportunity for rethinking what science is and who can participate in it. I wanted to touch a little more about the methods that these authors used when analyzing the different articles and academic papers and how co-authors were added into their research. So, to reiterate, they created measurable parameters for the study by creating a rating system that defines participatory. I'm going to use a metaphor that they had as an example in this article to better explain what I mean by each level of participation. To start, you have contractual. Let's say you have a primary investigator who has gotten permission from a farmer to use their land to collect their data or study how a species is interacting on their property. What keeps this participation level contractual is that the farmer is never asked to put their personal input and experience on how that species interacts with their property. Because once you start to involve the farmer's personal perspective, you become a consultative level of participation. And that includes where the primary investigator will ask maybe the expert in the field that they're studying a few questions to get their input, and that is about it. Because once you start to involve the non-academic professional in the research and how that research is conducted, or maybe the methods being used, you get into collaborative research and participation. And then the last level is collegial. This means that the non-academic professional has almost full authority in not only the questions being asked, the research methods being used, they also have authority on how their information and knowledge is going to be presented and written about so that they are not appropriated or maybe misunderstood by the scientific community. Having these clear definitions of what it means to be participatory in a research study will help get rid of the researchers who misuse the word, because not all participatory research should be labeled as such. Okay, Let's switch gears here a little bit and go into the assumptions that an article makes. So I took this question a little differently from the last assignment and kind of viewed this as what assumptions does this article make about the reader? So, does the person reading the article understand the parameters and methodology of scientific research projects? So, for instance, would a non-professional academic interested in understanding the debate of why they should be included in authorship fully understand the process of research and what each phase means? For example, are they making assumptions that the reader knows the role and ethical duty of a primary investigator and what the relationship between a participant and the investigator should actually look like, so they will understand how to maybe argue their case or understand what they're signing up for in the first place? Then let's read this article through a different lens. Let's say from an actual academic professional who is interested in this type of ethical debate. So, is the author's case strong enough for why a researcher should discuss the definition of authorship to make the fear of not getting the accreditation they need or want in their academic field? What I mean by this is that in some stances, having who you have as a co-author on your paper can define your credibility as a researcher in the first place and can potentially even lead to monetary gain, to employment opportunities, or to even tenure if you're in the field of academia. So, if there is a chance that by including a non-academic or non-professional researcher into your co-authorship, that could, in some cases, lead to you not achieving your career goals, which causes a reasonable fear for some investigators to not include the co-authors that should be in there. Lastly, still viewing this article through the lens of a professional researcher, have the authors laid out a clear path before them in order to start those effective conversations with their participants about authorship and the ownership of their knowledge being created? What I mean by this, they've emphasized the importance of researchers to have these conversations with their participants, but they really did not lay out maybe a clear path or a starting point of these conversations to make this transition of methodology and thinking easier for researchers. Okay, what is agreeable about this text? For me personally, I agreed with a lot of the cases that these authors made for why we should change the definition of authorship and how we can make it maybe more inclusive for the non-professional academics. I agree that there should be guidelines created to inform a researcher how to give credit or acknowledgement to their participants, with the caveat knowing that some of these participants may not want to be credited or identified. I also believe that the more involved a participant is in the research, they should be equally acknowledged for their input and the ownership of the information. This is especially important when working with marginalized populations. They honestly should have ownership in how their information is being presented and their research process, so that this no longer allows for the appropriation of their culture or a creation/support of stereotypes. And then they didn't touch on it too heavily, but I did pull this insight from this article that even in this field of research, there needs to be a systematic change of how we value research and who knowledge gets to count. Basically, a revered journal or news publication should not have the power to say your research does not count because you've allowed a participant to be too involved. Now, since I found most of this article to be agreeable, I had a little bit of trouble finding what to argue, so I might have missed the point on this, but from my understanding, not all researchers will be capable of relinquishing the value that their system has set in place for whose knowledge counts in both the scientific and political realms. In order to create a more ethical, inclusive, scientific research society. Also, I would like to argue that in order to kind of push for this more inclusive participatory research between both professionals and non-professional academic researchers, I think we need to figure out a way to better educate our communities that are actually being studied to showcase how important their role really is. There is evidence that the currency of academic publication has value outside of the academy. This means that some of the participants in these research studies might not know that by contributing their knowledge, they actually could make social impact and change within their community. And those changes cannot be made without the suggestions and the knowledge that they bring to the table of participatory research. And last but not least, what did I find aspirational about this article? Since I am not a sociology major, the majority of the time when I'm reading these different articles or journal entries, I'm viewing them from a lens of a design researcher. And this article in particular got me thinking, are we giving our non-academic professionals, aka the consumer, the credit that they are due when they are involved in our research process? For example, on some of the projects that I've worked on in the past, we've been developing personal hygiene products for the aging population. Since most of the designers in the room are not in the 65 plus population, it was important for us to go to those consumers to ask them, what are your challenges with personal hygiene? What are your pain points? What do you see as a possibility of a personal hygiene product as a toothbrush? Can you grip it better? We take the knowledge and the experience of these consumers and ideate solutions around them to fit their needs. But I don't believe as a designer we ever really give credit to the consumers that we interview as part of this process. Just like an academic scientific researcher can gain maybe career benefits or tenure within their field of study, or maybe more credentials, and possibly monetary gain from doing their research, designers are in that boat as well. We can get monetary gain from designing these products based off of consumer experience, but are we doing enough to credit the consumers? And I think the answer is no. And that leads to me believe, how can we audit the design process to include the people we are working with more effectively and more authentically? This also got me thinking about my own thesis project and potentially how can I give credit and ownership of the knowledge to my participants. For instance, I will be developing sensory products for patients living with dementia, but I will be relying heavily on the knowledge and experience of their family members and their caregivers and aides on what those products should even be. So this leads me to ask my thesis advisor next time I meet with him, how can I give authentic credit and acknowledgement to all of the people who are going to participate in my research project? Anywho, thank you so much for listening to this assessment, and I really look forward to talking with the rest of you about this topic further.